Okay, today oh, that's not popping up. Today our goal says I use strategies to start nonfiction summaries. So we're going to talk today about ways, why is that not popping up, that we can write our nonfiction summaries to make it fiction summary really powerful. So everybody should have I shouldn't see that rolling chair going around the room. Put it back.
I'm not being called around.
All right, yesterday we talked about these nonfiction text structures. On the next page, you're going to glue in your summary, and I want you to pay attention to how you're gluing it in. This summary, I've already folded this note that Celia passed out. When you open up, it looks like this. There's this little, so if you leave it where it is, the way it was, you'll notice there's like this little flap here. You are going to glue just the little flap. And then you're going to place it like this in the middle of your notebook. So that when you open it, you can see your notes. Getting a glue stick requires no conversation. You know where they're kept in the classroom. So all I did was I put glue on the little tab, and then I put it face down, so now my notebook opens like this. And I'm actually going to start off taking notes on this today. Yes, Ryan? Not right this second. Actually, go quick, because just go quick. All right. So today we're going to use this thing. It's called Unlocking a Nonfiction Summary. When you're doing a nonfiction summary, there's 3 key ideas or key things I want you guys to remember. The first is about details. Differentiate between interesting and important. That means when you're reading a story, a nonfiction excerpt, actually not a story, you should be figuring out what is the most important thing and not necessarily focusing just on the interesting things you've read. I'm showing you this. The next important thing when you're writing a nonfiction summary is to identify the text structure. When we identify the text structure, it helps us understand why an author wrote his piece or her piece, and it helps us summarize it because we know the purpose behind it. I should not see this many noses and mouths. Thank you. So figure out what details are important, figure out what the text structure is, and then identify the central idea and details. You guys might have heard it called the main idea before. We tend to say central idea as you get older because it's the big picture topic, the big idea. So when we're writing a nonfiction summary, we figure out the important details, the text structure, and the central idea. Now I can tell you, when I'm reading summaries, I can usually tell from the first sentence if you understood what the text was or not. We are going to practice today, tomorrow, and as we're doing our nonfiction stuff, how to write nonfiction summaries using a sentence starter that's going to start us off strong. We're going to use this combination to write our main idea sentence. When we write our main idea sentence, we're going to identify the text. That means give the title. We're going to give a verb. Use the text structure. we're going to identify the topic and the big ideas or important details. And actually could do this central idea. I'm going to show you how this is done. We're going to use the same article that we read last week. I'm going to have Ramon pass it out for me. Go fast. Central idea. All right, at the bottom, I wrote the American Civil War lasted from 1861 to 1865 and was the result of a period of many tense years between the northern states and southern states. The major issue between the North and South was slavery. Starting in the 1850s, the Northerners became more and more hostile to the idea of slavery on moral grounds, while slavery continued to impact the accepted fact of life in the South. This is similar to a couple of things I saw on the summaries that I was reading between the two classes. Here's the problem. This summary is exactly what the first paragraph says. And it only provided information from the first paragraph. So this summary is not a summary. Even though it sounded good, it doesn't provide the correct information. I want everyone to make sure their notes are looking like my notes, including all the stuff I put on the side. So today we're going to write a main idea sentence from this work. So hopefully you guys have a little bit of space right here to write our main idea sentence. Does anybody, do we want to read this article first? You guys remember it from the other day?
I don't.
All right, so we're going to read through it real quick. I just read the first paragraph. I'm going to read the second one. In early to mid-1800s, large farms called plantations were the backbone of Southern economy. Cotton, a cheap material used in everyday life all over the world, was one of the most important crops grown on plantations. As a result, cotton plantations multiplied throughout the region. Soon the South had become the main grower and exporter of cotton for Europe and a powerful economic force. Many people were required to work on plantations, and the Southern plantation owners relied on slaves as the cheapest form of labor to work the fields. Slaves who worked in the fields typically lived in shacks in the slave quarters, a distance from the main house where the owners' families lived. They were given very little free time and required to be answerable to the plantation owner. Some slaves even worked inside the home of plantation owners, cleaning the house, or as the nanny to children. All right, most of this is telling me that they needed slaves. Plantation owners relied on slaves as the cheapest form of labor. I'm going to go ahead and put that. Plantations were the backbone of Southern economy. Those are going to be important things to remember. Hopefully you're doing what I'm doing. Slaves were considered property. They worked on plantations, in shops, in towns, and cities, in the construction of railroads. In the South, slaves were just another part of the landscape. Slaves were considered property. A different understanding of slavery, however, was beginning to take shape in the North. Taking the most progressive stand of the day, the Vermont Constitution of 1777 insisted all men were born equally free and independent and added a clause prohibiting slavery based on this belief. The Declaration of Independence, in stating all men are created equal, inspired Vermont to prohibit slavery. and its constitution in 1777. By 1804, all northern states north of Maryland had voted to abolish slavery, many through a process of gradual emancipation, which set deadlines by which a slave must be freed, depending on the work done or the age reached. During the antebellum period, 1815 to 1860, the North began a process of modernization and industrialization. Industrial advances allowed for the development and expansion of new industries like transportation, roads, canals, and railroads, communications, magazines and newspapers, and finance, banking and insurance. These industries fueled the demand for wage labor, which was partially met by the influx of immigrants from Europe. Refugees from European political and economic conditions sought the freedoms of American life, and many settled in the northern states. So this whole paragraph seems to be about two things. The first thing it seems to be about, all states north of Maryland voted to abolish slavery. So slavery is not seen as a good thing in the North. We're on this. Where's that? Get it out. Slavery is seen as not great from the North standpoint. And then the North began a process of modernization and industrialization. So since they don't need slaves, they start to vote against it. The biggest reason that people fought over whether or not people should have been slaves is because of money. It's not the only reason, but it's the biggest reason. By the 1850s, the majority of people in the North were opposed to the expansion of slavery and against allowing new states to join the United States as slave states. Some people were opposed to slavery for moral reasons, and they formed a movement in the North called abolitionism, which called for the legal end to slavery in all the United States. The wealthy southern states saw abolitionism as a threat to their way of life and fought against the northern states politically whenever there was a chance. When Abraham Lincoln, a Republican from Illinois who believed firmly in the Union as opposed to states' rights to choose their own practices regarding slavery, taxes, and other issues, was elected president in 1860, it was too much for the southern states. And so soon after Lincoln took office, 7 southern states, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, seceded from the United States of America and formed the Confederate States of America so they could rule themselves as they saw fit. So, this one's telling me about the North they formed a movement in the North called abolitionism. That's an important fact. After Abraham Lincoln took office, 7 states seceded from the United States of America. President Lincoln knew that the Confederacy was a rebellion that would have to be brought back to the federal government. On April 12, 1861, the first shots of the American Civil War were fired upon the Union soldiers at Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. The Northern troops were defeated quickly and they retreated. Soon after, 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, joined the Confederacy and entered the fight. We're just going to do that. First, President Lincoln knew the Confederacy was a rebellion that had to be brought back to the government. The American Civil War lasted 4 years and claimed the lives of approximately 620,000 soldiers. Fierce battles were fought throughout the country, and many lost their lives due to the wounds suffered and diseases spread from poor sanitary conditions. The war was bitter, with most young men leaving home to join the fight, sometimes clashing with family members from the other side on the battlefields. The North was at an advantage. With access to more soldiers as well as factories that could quickly churn out wartime materials, they were often able to fight harder and longer. So we'll say the North had an advantage, and that the war lasted 4 years and claimed approximately 620,000 lives. Some of the most famous battles of the Civil War took place in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, Bull Run, Virginia, and Antietam, Maryland. Although one side or the other was technically victorious after these battles, each battle and the war in general could be considered a horrific victory. There are such devastating costs on both sides of the war that the victory felt like a defeat. We're going to just do that last one. After many long years in battles, the Confederates surrendered. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee of the Confederacy surrendered to General and future President Ulysses S. Grant of the Union at the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. We're just going to do the Confederates surrendered. What we've just gone through and done, so we've already read this one time. So when you're reading nonfiction, and it's something short like an article or a piece of paper like this, it's important to go through and read one time just to get the gist or the idea. You've probably talked about that in social studies. So the first time we read it the other day, we got the gist. Now what we just did was we went through and we identified important facts. Some of the facts might have been interesting. So like when it talks about the plantation owners relying on slaves, it talked about the conditions. The conditions of the slaves is an interesting fact. The important fact from this is to know that slavery was needed for the South to keep their way of life. At that last paragraph, because that's probably fresh in your mind, interesting to know where they surrendered. Important to know who surrendered. All right? So now that we've identified the important facts, we need to identify the text structure. So we're going to look at our text structure and think. Was it description, sequence and order, compare and contrast, cause and effect, or problem solution? Is there any off the bat that I really know this definitely wasn't that text structure? What text structure was it definitely not? LJ. Definitely not compare and contrast. I'm not comparing two things. Had I compared like the northern side and the southern side and like how they fought and who was in charge, that would have been compare and contrast. But I did not. What else could it not be? Ramon.
Problem solution.
It wasn't problem solution. It wasn't saying what was wrong with the war and then giving solutions for these problems. What else could it not be? Luke.
Sequence and order.
It wasn't really sequence and order because it kind of jumped around from like place to place. So we got problems, no, we got cause and effect and description left. Which one do we think it was? Ayla. Description. All this is doing is giving me a description or describing the Civil War. So when I write my nonfiction summary, and I'm just going to turn this way. I'm going to start off with identifying the text structure, and the central idea here is going to be the Civil War. So now we're going to use this to write our main idea sentence. Our main idea sentence is going to start off by identifying the text. I'm going to put parentheses, the American Civil War. In the American Civil War. The author. So all nonfiction summary should start off the same. It should say in, whatever the title is, the author. So we identified the text. In the American Civil War, the author, what is the author doing? So we got to look up at the text the text structure. If we go back to this text structure page, you remember when I had you guys put these on the side?
Yeah.
These are going to be the verbs you use. So if you're reading a description article, you're going to say, in the article, the author describes. If you're reading a compare and contrast, you're going to say, in the article, the author compares. If it was cause and effect, you're going to say, in the article, the author illustrates. In this case, we were doing description, so we're going to say the author describes. So in the American Civil War, the author describes, and this is going to sound kind of redundant or repetitive, but what's he describing?
The Civil War.
The Civil War. Describes the Civil War. That is my big idea sentence. Or I'm sorry, my main sentence. All I have to do now that I've made that sentence is go through and add in my important details. So if we were to, let's go ahead and just like mark a bullet point here. Add important details. So if I were to continue writing this, I would just write something like, plantations were the backbone of Southern economy because they were the cheapest form of labor. Slaves were considered property, but the North didn't agree with that. The North started to modernize and industrialize and thought they should get rid of slaves. When President Lincoln took office, some states seceded in the South to form the Confederate States. And the president knew they'd have to be brought back. The war lasted for 4 years, and the North was at an advantage. Both sides had a devastating cost, but eventually the Confederates surrendered. That right there is my summary. All I did was add probably about 5 sentences onto it. Now, sometimes you might add more, sometimes you might add less. I tend to say between each section, you should probably have like one important detail. We did each paragraph. Probably that was a little more than what we needed, but I wanted to show you guys how to pick out those important details. Maddie. Maddie. Okay, Carter.
So, would this be okay if we did by paragraph or like?
I would try not to do by paragraph all the time because it's going to be too many details in a lot of situations.
Okay.
I did by paragraph here because, okay, so you can't really tell, but I actually chopped this up from different headings and glued it together just to make it fit on one page so I didn't have to print multiple pages. So, like, if you think about a Scholastic News article looks something like this, where this whole thing is talking about pollution solutions. And this one talks about clean water. And this one talks about toxic trash, and reduce, and reuse, and recycle, and the air we breathe. I would probably try to do, like, a detail from each of those. All right? Chapter books, maybe a detail or two from each chapter or, like, section. But that is unlocking a nonfiction summary. Writing out the important details part is the same. It's pretty basic for description and sequence and order because you're just going to write out the details in the order that they're given. When it comes to writing out the details from compare, contrast, cause and effect, and problem solution, it's going to look different, and we're actually going to talk about that and practice that tomorrow. All right? Today, I'm going to meet with a couple of groups. If you are wanting to read some nonfiction in my room, I do have several books over there. My most interesting ones are probably towards the front because I pulled some interesting stories yesterday for my class. I'm going to call some groups over. If you would like to, like, fold this and stick this in your nonfiction section, that would probably be a good idea so you know where it's at.
Do we need our notebooks memorized?
Some people will when I call them over.